Well, good morning. Happy Father's Day, dads. I hope that you get everything your heart desires today. I hope every dad in this room gets everything their heart desires today. That's my hope for you. It's my blessing for you today. Hey, we're in a series called Reign or Ruin. And last week we looked at King David. This week we're going to look at King Solomon. Next week, we'll look at King Ahab, and finally, on the last week of the series, we will look at King Josiah. And we said last week that we're going to talk about some things in this series that maybe aren't typically the way that these stories have been understood or fully told, and we're certainly doing that today. Today, we have a lot of information on Solomon. It only covers a few chapters, really, in the book of 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 11, and yet his life takes so many turns in it that I wanted to show today just how crazy the story is. So hopefully, you'll hang in there with us and see, like, there's big payoff, I think, in understanding where things finally go wrong. I also want to let you know that at the end of this series, we're going to be offering baptisms. So baptisms at Verve City Church, the best way we understand that is that it is obedience to the thing that Jesus invited you to do right after you put your faith in Jesus. And so it is an outward sign of an inward reality, but it's something more than that. There is significance in going down into the water and symbolizing that old self passing away and coming up out of it, and symbolizing that new self coming to life, surrounded by friends and family members and your church just screaming and hollering and yelling for you and being excited for you. It is a monumental day for people in their lives and in their journey with Jesus Christ. So if you've been thinking about baptism, but you haven't quite done it just yet, I just want to encourage you that on June 29th at our 9 and our 11 o'clock services, we're going to have an awesome celebration of baptism and would love for you to be a part of it and would encourage you to sign up just as soon as you can. In 2014 or so, I started seeing some magazine covers with a particular CEO on them from Silicon Valley, and she was becoming clearly like the next big thing. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and she led a company called Theranos. Theranos was a company that the idea was, instead of, some of you had to spend a lot of time in the hospital, you get all these blood tests done, tons and tons of blood gets drawn, and they have to send different blood samples out for different tests. Her idea was, we're going to be able to take just like one prick of your finger and use that one prick to do all the blood tests that have been done with all the blood that's been drawn out of you before. She was like the anti-vampire. We're going to take a little less blood than we used to. And it sounded like a brilliant idea, and she was on the cover of Forbes and Inc., and she was at tons of conferences, and she was hailed as perhaps the next Steve Jobs, this young, brilliant startup. And they even cut a deal with Walgreens. Walgreens was going to put a Theranos center in every single one of their pharmacies all across the United States so that people could come in for these blood tests. They cut that deal. Walgreens started overhauling their stores. They spent millions and millions of dollars doing so, only to find out the technology didn't work. It had never worked. She lied about the whole thing. And she convinced people in her company to lie about it as well. There's, in fact, a book that was released called Bad Blood a few years ago about it. She was eventually sentenced in prison. She's to prison time. She is serving a prison sentence right now. Walgreens was out something like $50 million for their investment, and the company that was at one point worth billions was worth nothing overnight once it came out that it was never anything to start with. By the way, it's a fascinating book if you're ever interested in learning about how someone can rise and fall quickly. What you'll learn as you read through the book is that you can gain the whole world and lose your soul. In fact, this is such a wise saying that it's almost the kind of thing that Jesus would say. Jesus did say this. So in Mark chapter 8, he said, what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? There's a story of a king that's told in the Old Testament. It's told in a couple of places, but the version we're going to be looking at today is in 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 11. It's the story of Solomon, and I want to give you just a little bit of background on Solomon, first of all. You need to know a little bit about Israel's history going into this. I'm going to be short on this because we just don't have a long time to hang out on it, but it's important. If we go with traditional dating, that which Israel would have probably understood to be the dates, Moses leads Israel out of Egypt through the Exodus, right? They were slaves in Egypt, and Moses leads them out of Egypt somewhere around 1400 BC. And then they wander in the desert for 40 years, but they eventually enter into the promised land, this land that God had set aside for them, and he was going to fulfill the promise he had made to Abraham, their ancestor, that he was going to bless them so that they could bless the world. At this point in human history, Israel is God's answer to what are you doing about the sin problem in the world that has separated your people from you. God says, I'm going to bless Israel, And I'm going to show the whole world that I'm inviting them to come back to me. And I'm going to use Israel as my vessel to do that. So he makes the promise to Abraham that his descendants are going to be the ones who are blessed to bless the whole world. Those descendants then end up enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And around 1400 BC, according to tradition, they come out of Egypt through the Exodus. And they spend 40 years wandering in the desert. They enter into the promised land eventually. Then they have several hundred years of judges. These are people who didn't serve as kings, but when Israel was in trouble, they would step up and they would serve in ways to defeat Israel's enemies. These people were usually not awesome as human beings, very complicated figures. And then by the end of that several hundred years, Israel's ready for a king. They see all the other surrounding nations have a king, they want a king. Samuel tells them, warns them, like, hey, if we give you a king, king is going to, it's going to force your kids into the military. King is going to take taxes from you. We don't care. We want a king. God wanted to be their king, but they wanted a king. And so the first king, Saul, comes to the throne. And then after him, David comes to the throne. David unites the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel and Judah together to make one united kingdom. And it's the first time in Israel's history, and it'll be fairly short-lived, that the north and the south are combined. And he defeats all of his enemies, and he has a lot of blood on his hands. And one of the things David wants to do is build a temple to God, Yahweh, the one who appointed me king, the one who has protected our nation, the one who has blessed us so that we can be a blessing. But the Lord doesn't allow him to build the temple because David has too much blood on his hands. And so he tells David, I'm going to have your son Solomon. Doesn't actually name him in the passage, but I'm going to have your son build a temple for me instead. So David's son Solomon comes to power. That's a whole bloody ordeal in and of itself. We don't have time to get into all the details today. But he comes to power. And after Solomon comes to power, he wants to rule well. And so that's where we're picking up the story today with this united kingdom. These people have been fighting their enemies for years. Solomon is going to come and be the king during a time of peace. But this story, just as a little bit of foreshadowing, does not end well. So when you come to the scriptures then, a lot of times we just read the scriptures and we're just, sometimes we're just sprinting through them. Sometimes we're trying to see where we are in the story, and that can be a helpful lens. Sometimes we're just trying to consume it as pure information, get through it as quickly as possible. But there's a few questions that I think are really helpful that you can bring to any scripture reading that'll kind of shed a little bit more light on it. So questions like, why did people find it important to tell this story? Why do people find it important to tell this story? And one of the ways you can answer this question is to ask a second question, which was what was happening in the world at that time. When the story of 1 Kings is written down, the story of Solomon, when 1 and 2 Samuel are written down, now they're probably borrowing from all kinds of sources, but when they're finally put together into something resembling what we know them as today, it probably happened during the exile of Israel when the Assyrians in the north and then the Babylonians in the south defeated Israel. Israel was defeated in 596 BC and started to ship Israelites away to Babylon. The king there, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, actually put a vassal king in charge of Israel at that time. It was the son of Josiah, who we'll look at in a few weeks, named Zedekiah. And then Zedekiah stopped paying tribute to Babylon, and it really made Nebuchadnezzar mad. So in 586 BC, he marched into Jerusalem after starving the people there for about 18 months. He killed almost everybody. He tore down the walls. They were so furious, they threw the walls of the city into the valley, and they completely tore down the temple. And so then more and more people are shipped off to Babylon as slave labor, and lots of people are killed or starved to death. And it seems that these stories were finally written down in the form we know them today during that exile, before Israel came back underneath Nehemiah and others. And so the historical situation that they're wrestling with as these stories are being written down is simply asking this question: how did we end up here if we are God's chosen people? Like, we were in the promised land, our kings were in charge. Now we've been conquered by first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. How did we end up here if we are God's chosen people? And the story of Solomon is going to show them how they ended up here. It's going to show the long, slow descent that began under Solomon. Another great question to ask when you come to the scriptures: what does this tell us about how people understood who they were and who God was at that time? And what we're going to learn today is that the people understood themselves to have a history of unfaithfulness and for God to have a history of faithfulness. And that, I think, is a message, a lesson that we can all learn, that we have a tendency toward unfaithfulness, but God has a tendency toward faithfulness. God is always faithful. We are unfaithful. So Moses preaches this sermon, and it's captured in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is hundreds of years before there's ever a king. And one of the things that Moses says to the people that gets written down is this. Deuteronomy 17:14. You're about to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and you settle there, you may think we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. And if this happens, be sure to select as king the man the Lord your God chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. So far, so good. This was the pattern already. Saul was an Israelite. David was an Israelite. Solomon was an Israelite. And all of them seemed to be the men who God had anointed, appointed, chosen. The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses. For the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. Just take that in. Here's some things the king should not do. The king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth and silver and gold for himself. When he sits on the throne as king, then, he must copy for himself this body of instruction on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. He must always keep that copy with him and read it daily as long as he lives. That way he will learn to fear the Lord his God by obeying all the terms of these instructions and decrees. So here's what the king's supposed to do. If you have a king, here's what he's supposed to he's supposed to write a copy of this himself by hand. That he's not supposed to have a lot of horses. He's not supposed to trade with Egypt. He's not supposed to have a lot of wives. He shouldn't accumulate a lot of gold. He should write that out by hand, and then he should carry a copy of that with him at all times, and he should read from it daily so that he can remember what he's not supposed to do. Because the instruction that Moses is giving the people is simply this, really: don't let your king become a new Pharaoh. You were slaves under Pharaoh. And when someone starts to accumulate too much wealth and too much power, they start to see other people as not those who they should be serving, but simply as more ways that they can accumulate more wealth and more power. They can use other people. And so the king is supposed to write this down himself and read it daily. Solomon becomes king, and in 1 Kings chapter 3, we see Solomon's dream. Now, dreams in the ancient world, first of all, isn't it a lovely place to sleep? That's just a lovely bedding. Love that. Blankets look nice. But the thread count's really high in those things. So Solomon has a dream. But now when we think of dreams, we think, dreams are imaginary. We think they have very little relationship to actual life. But in the ancient Near East, in Solomon's day, and even still today, dreams can sometimes be more real than life is. Dreams can sometimes be the method by which God in the Jewish tradition, or the gods in some of the other traditions, can actually speak to you. And so Solomon has a dream, and in this dream, God approaches him. And God approaches him and says, Solomon, because your father David was faithful to me. Now, last week we looked at David, and we said he's a really complicated figure. Tons of blood on his hands, doesn't treat people very well. Like, why is he such a revered king in Israel's history? And the reason is because he never worshiped other gods. He was the king that refused to worship other gods. He always worshiped Yahweh. Even when he did all kinds of terrible things, he still tried to keep his focus on Yahweh. So because of your father David's faithfulness, God says to Solomon, I'll grant you whatever you wish. You ask for it, and I'll grant it for you. And Solomon could have asked for wealth, and he could have asked for power, but instead in the dream, he asked God for wisdom. He says, Lord, there are so many people that I'm supposed to be governing right now. He's very young when this happens. There's so many people I'm supposed to be governing right now. And if you don't give me wisdom, I don't know how I'll be a good king. God is so pleased with his request in the dream that he tells him, because you asked for wisdom instead of wealth and power, I'm going to give it all to you. I'm going to give you wisdom, and I'm going to give you wealth, and I'm going to give you power. You can have it all. And then he wakes up from the dream but realizes it was true. I never have dreams this good, by the way. Never, ever, ever. I had a dream a few years ago, and my wife and I were visiting my parents, and it was very hot. Their AC had gone out in July in Texas. I don't want to talk about it. So they had put a fan in our room at one point. And I went to sleep sweating and just like not comfortable. And in this dream, I saw this cat. And if you don't know me very well, cats are evil. And so this cat was walking by. I don't like them. And it looked at me. And in my dream, the cat looks at me and opens its mouth really, really wide. And right in my face, it goes, remember waking up and realized that the fan in the room was going, yeah, so that had worked its way into my dream. That's the kind of crud I dream about, okay? I don't ever have God approach me and be like, anything you want, wealth, power, wisdom, all yours, man. But Solomon does. Solomon has that happen to him. And indeed, we are told after that Solomon has tons of wisdom, that there's never been a king like him before, and there will never be a king like him after. In fact, the way of Solomon was so famous in the ancient world that lots of kings of other countries ended up fashioning their throne rooms after the throne room of Solomon. It says that Solomon had 12 golden lions surrounding his throne. And so we have archaeological evidence of other kings that chose to do this, apparently to fashion themselves after Solomon. His wisdom is well known. He is thought, like there are some traditions, this is not in the Bible, but there are some traditions of him talking to animals. Like he was able to talk to, like a Dr. Dolittle Solomon. That's kind of amazing. He could talk to them, he could understand them. There are other traditions where he understands all of biology, understands how to grow and cultivate plants and herbs that no one else could. This was the way that he was thought of in the ancient world. In fact, in Jamaica, Solomon is considered to be the one who came up with marijuana. They call it wisdom weed there, and like Solomon is connected to that. So he's been connected to all kinds of things all over the world because of the legend of how wise and intelligent and smart he's supposed to be. And God essentially says, look, because you asked for wisdom, I'll give you more. Because you asked for wisdom, I'll give it all to you. So he becomes the envy of the ancient world, according to 1 Kings. And other rulers actually come to sit underneath his teaching, to listen to him, to hear him, to understand how it is that he's ruling his kingdom. In fact, in 1 Kings chapter 10, the queen of Sheba visits him. And this is what she says. She exclaimed to the king, everything I heard in my country about your achievements and wisdom is true. I didn't believe what was said until I arrived here and saw it with my own eyes. In fact, I had not heard the half of it. Your wisdom and prosperity are far beyond what I was told. How happy your people must be. What a privilege for your officials to stand here day after day, listening to your wisdom. Praise the Lord your God who delights in you and has placed you on the throne of Israel. If someone said this many kind things to me, I would assume they were asking me for money, okay? How happy everyone who knows you must be. How delighted your children must be to sit at your feet every day and listen to your... No, my children are not happy about that. But it's a really kind thing for you to say. She just really piles on. But then she ends with something we're about to look at. And I believe for the compilers of these stories, the way she ends is far more important than anything she has said up until this point. Here's the last thing she says. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king so you can rule with justice and righteousness. In other words, Solomon, you're incredibly wise, you're incredibly smart, and your nation seems to be going incredibly well. One, it's God's doing and not yours. And two, the reason that God has gifted you with such wisdom and brilliance is so that you can rule with justice and so that you can rule with righteousness. It's like a reminder to Solomon, you've been blessed to be a blessing. And right after this story, the authors of 1 Kings start to give us major hints that what the Queen of Sheba told him he should do, rule with justice, rule with righteousness, he is not doing. And by the time we get to chapter 11, it's full-blown out in the open. This is not happening. See, at some point along the way, and look, scholars, I've read so much on Solomon in the last few weeks because what I wanted to know is like, what is the prevailing wisdom? What is the prevailing thought? What is the scholarly consensus on how it is that Solomon ends up turning? And we'll look at his turn in just a moment. But going from like, you have all the wisdom and the wealth and the power, God's given it all to you, to you're going to actually turn your back on that God and worship other gods. What is it that happened in his life that caused him to do that? And here's the tragic reality. We don't know. There's not like one thing that happens and then suddenly he becomes the villain in the story, right? A lot of times in the movies we watch, like there's a character arc where like, oh, this person was pretty good and this horrible thing happened, then they became the bad guy, right? And so now you feel sympathetic toward them to some degree. You can kind of, well, at least like that's tough, but at least I can see where the turn happened. Our lives are rarely so easy to map out. So I don't know precisely what happens in Solomon's heart. And that's actually the thing about drift, isn't it? Like when we start in a good place or we start with good intentions, but then we start to slowly drift over time, it's not usually so easy to map out exactly what happened. Like drift is rarely loud. It's a quiet undoing. It's the kind of thing where in retrospect, you can look back and say, wow, I've actually been drifting for quite some time. But in the moment, it's often easy to ignore because you've drifted just a little bit more today than you did yesterday. It was slow, but steady. Right before Sheba has come, Solomon has constructed the temple. And the way that he's constructed the temple, it says that he conscripted a labor force of 30,000 men from all of Israel. Just to name it, a conscripted labor force means he forced people to build the temple, and then he forced people to build his palace. 30,000 of them Israelites. The same people who were once slaves in Egypt being forced to make bricks for pharaohs, their ancestors are now Israelites being forced to build a temple for God and a palace for Solomon in Israel by their own king. That's where we've gone with it. He sent them to Lebanon in shifts, 10,000 every month, so that each man would be 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. In other words, Solomon uses slave labor to build the temple. And to be really clear too, Solomon builds the temple in 7 years. It takes 7 years for him to build this ornate temple. For his palace, though, it takes 13. The house he builds for God is beautiful and ornate and amazing, 7 years. The palace he builds for himself, 13 years. 7, typically, by the way, is the number of perfection or wholeness or completion in Hebrew numerology. 2 of those would be 14. So 14 would be like double sevens, right? But 13 would be short of perfection. So it's about twice as long, but short of perfection. There seems to be a lot of signaling that's happening here. And then in 1 Kings 10, right after Sheba leaves, it says that the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. That's about 25 tons of gold. It was 666 talents of gold besides that which came from the traders and from the business of the merchants and from all the kings of Arabia and the governments of the land. And you'll remember, Solomon, theoretically, should be walking around with a scroll in his own handwriting, reminding himself of the Deuteronomy 17 passage that he is not supposed to amass a lot of gold. He is not supposed to marry a lot of wives. He is not supposed to trade with Egypt or get horses or mass lots of horses and chariots from them. He's not supposed to do those things. And here we see these 666 talents of gold, 25 talents of gold. By the way, this number 666, Revelation conspiracy theorists, calm down. We're not going there, okay? But the number 666 is important. And it depends on who you read. Look, there's different commentators that have different beliefs on this, but I find the thing I'm going to share with you compelling. I'm not saying it's definitely the only way to interpret this, because it's not, but I find it compelling. So here's what you need to know about ancient Hebrew. In ancient Hebrew, there's no superlative. You can't say that something is the great S. That EST ending that we have in English, great S, meaning that there's nothing greater than that, right? It is the great S. There's no superlative in ancient Hebrew. So the way that they would get across that something was a superlative was through semantic repetition. So for instance, it's the Song of Songs. What is that? Sometimes you double up and sometimes you triple up, but it's semantic repetition. Song of Songs means it's the best song. It's the songiest of all the songs, okay? Song of Songs. So, the King of Kings, all right? It's the kingiest of all the kings. He's like this is the king. Or the Holy of Holies. This is the holiest that you'll ever see. Sometimes it's a repetition of 3. So it's holy, 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 right? So the reason so many of the songs that you read in the book of Psalms or even in the book of Revelation have this triad of holies, holy, 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 because it was their way of saying that God is the holiest. There's no superlative, so he is holy, holy, holy. The number of 6 is the number of perfection. The number 7 is the number of perfection. So 1 short of perfection was oftentimes a symbolic way of saying that it was imperfect. And if you have the number 666, it's a triad, a repetition of imperfection, meaning it is perhaps the most imperfect. How much gold is Solomon amassing? The most imperfect amount of gold. The most imperfect amount of gold. In other words, he's doing something he's not supposed to be doing. The text is alerting us that trouble is coming. And sure enough, over the next several verses, we find out that all kinds of stuff is happening. Solomon's drift. First of all, he's amassing thousands of chariots and horses. The king that's not supposed to amass chariots and horses is amassing chariots and horses. He's importing and exporting those chariots to other countries. He's importing some of these chariots and horses from Egypt, and he's selling them to other nations. He's become an arms dealer. He's become an arms dealer and a slave owner. That's who he's become. He uses forced slave labor to build his temple and his palace. He marries foreign wives to further his political goals, right? If you could marry wives from other nations, from other religious traditions, then you could consolidate some of your power. That nation now has good feelings towards you and it might open up better trade deals for you. If they have like some skin in the game. They now have one of their princesses married into Israel, and so he seems to be marrying because it's politically advantageous. Solomon, in other words, has become the new Pharaoh. He starts off seeking wisdom and being told what an amazing choice that is by God. But over time, he begins to do every single thing that Moses said the kings should not do. And over time, we learn that Solomon is using his great wealth and power to gain more wealth and more power. The two things that you will find over and over and over again in Israel's story that God gets angry with them for is worshiping other gods and refusing to look out for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the refugee. I don't mean it's in there a couple times. I mean it's in there hundreds and hundreds of times. Oftentimes it's preceded by the author of whichever book you happen to be in the Old Testament, reminding its readers, remember that you were slaves in Egypt once. It says that over and over and over, almost as if its authors want you to grapple with the fact that God is the God who stood up for the oppressed. God is the God who set the captives free. God is the God who broke the chains of your ancestors so that they could leave Pharaoh. And now Solomon has become the new Pharaoh. And Solomon has begun to use slave labor. And Solomon has become an arms dealer. And Solomon has accumulated the most imperfect amount of wealth. In 1 Kings 11, 1 and 3, we read this. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Can I just name? I would watch that reality TV show, okay? I wouldn't be proud of it. I wouldn't post about it on social media, but I would watch it. Okay, and in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. 700 wives and 300 concubines. Christmas was nuts, guys. Amazon was nonstop to this house. Like, it was insane. Now, our best guess based on archaeological finds is that Jerusalem, the city where Solomon lived, had somewhere between 3 and 8 high-end 10,000 people at this time. So it's very likely that these very round numbers of wives and concubines aren't supposed to be taken literally. But it's 1,000 wives and concubines. And so even if the number is not meant to be taken literally, it is meant to make a point. How many wives does Solomon have? Too many. He had too many. More than Moses permitted under Deuteronomy. And what happened? And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord, because of course they did. In this way, we read, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely, as his father David had done. What we learn by reading through Solomon's story is that no matter how wise you are, no matter how well you start, no matter if your heart is in the right place or not, every single human leader is a poor echo of heaven's authority. And so we need to be very careful not to align ourselves too closely with any particular human leader. And if we're leading, we need to be very careful to recognize that even the smartest and the wisest of men at one point in human history, with all of his wisdom and all of his knowledge and all of his power and all of his wealth, turned an entire nation away from God. We just need to be very humble about our own leadership, and we need to be very slow to follow after the leadership of others. On the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, Solomon even built a pagan shrine for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and another for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. These were gods, by the way, who demanded child sacrifice of some of the kings in the ancient Near East. And so these are God's spiritual forces that these other tribes were worshiping. And Solomon, the king of Israel, the leader of the nation that is supposed to follow Yahweh and Yahweh alone, sets up altars and makes sacrifices to these gods. Solomon built such shrines for all his foreign wives to use for burning incense and sacrificing to their gods. It's interesting that this happens on the Mount of Olives. On the Mount of Olives, it's a location in Jerusalem. This is where this takes place. Solomon, the king of Israel, sets up. Because of his own desires and his own heart, he turns his back on Yahweh, and he sets up these altars for these false gods. 1,000 years later, Jesus would stand in the same place. And instead of turning his back on his heavenly Father, he announced that he was willing to give up his own life in obedience to his heavenly Father. He announced that he was willing to trade his life for ours. In Luke chapter 22, 39 and 41 through 42, we read this. Then, accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and he went as usual to the Mount of Olives. He walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Like these authors of the New Testament, and Jesus himself, were very, very familiar with the geography of the Old Testament. They knew that there are certain places that carry more weight because they have more influence over Israel's history. And Jesus goes to the same place where Solomon's idolatry started to move the nation of Israel toward its downfall, and instead does what his ancestor David had done, which was to give his heart fully to the Lord. But he does it perfectly, whereas David did it very imperfectly. And he chooses to willingly lay down his life, not my will, your will be done. Whatever this takes, I am here to set these people free. And in the same place that had in many ways symbolized Israel's enslavement to money and wealth and power because of one king, Jesus sets the world free in his heart. He begins the journey to Calvary here. Not your will, but my will be done. Where Solomon failed, Jesus succeeded. In Matthew 12:42, Jesus says this, the Queen of Sheba will also stand up against this generation on judgment day and condemn it, for she came from a distant land to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But now someone greater than Solomon is here, but you refuse to listen. Jesus stood in the place that Solomon stood, and instead of worshiping false gods, he willingly gave his life. Jesus announced to his followers that there will be a lot of people who don't listen to me, but at some point they will see the light, because there is now one here, speaking of himself, who is greater than Solomon. And Jesus took a history that had been warped and deformed and broken, and he healed it in himself. If the very wisest among us can fall, if the most brilliant among us can make terrible, terrible decisions, we have to know that we have that within us as well. And the question becomes then, what will your story be? What will your story be? At the end of your life, and you, by the way, don't know if that is going to be next week or months from now or years from now, at the end of your life, what will your story be? Because the decisions you make today and the influences in your life today will very much determine where your story leads tomorrow. Solomon began with a good relationship with Yahweh, but over time, his desire for other things, for power, for wealth, for influence, like they began to crowd out the goodness of God in his life, and that influenced him down a negative path. What will your story be? It's Father's Day. Men of Verve City Church, what will your story be? Will you use your strength and power and knowledge and wisdom to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves? Or will you spend your entire life trying to gain more wealth and power and influence for yourself? The very wisest of us have fallen when it comes to this question. But Jesus has given us a way forward, a way toward healing. A few years ago, a pastor who I knew of but didn't know personally had a very famous moral failure. He ended up abusing his spiritual power within his church to have an affair with a woman in his church. And he was rightly forced to resign by his church and not to enter ministry again. It's a tragic tale, and unfortunately, we've seen it happen all too often in Christian churches. A few years after that took place, he was at a pastor's conference in Las Vegas, and he wasn't there to tell them how to be great pastors. He wasn't there to share with them from the scripture. He was there because they asked if he would be willing to come and share why it is that with such a thriving, successful church, with such a wonderful family, how he found himself in a place where he was willing to give all of that up in order to force himself on someone else in the congregation. Like, how did you get there? How does that happen? And he stood before the group of pastors as they asked this question, and he took a Bible in his hand, and he said, for the first 20 years of ministry looked like this. Preaching looked like this. Pages, heart, mouth, people. Pages, heart, mouth, people. I would study the scriptures, and I would immerse myself in the scriptures. And as I immersed myself in the scriptures, my heart would shift and change and transform. And then when I stood on the platform, when I stood at the pulpit, when I announced the transformation that was already happening in me, it wasn't just on the page. And in announcing that transformation, other people got to experience it as well. He said, but after years and years of doing that, I got burned out and tired and exhausted, and I started taking shortcuts instead of taking care of myself. And the pattern started to go pages, mouth, people. Pages, mouth, people. And what I was reading and what I was consuming was no longer finding lodging in my heart. You can be wise and brilliant, powerful and wealthy. But if the way of Jesus doesn't find lodging in your heart, all of that may be for nothing. What will your story be? In Verve City Church, as a church, right? A number of you would call this church your home. Some of you are visiting. Some of you are here for the first time. What will our story be, collectively? Because it's never just been about us as individuals. It's been about us collectively. What will our story be? There's a lot of narratives we could choose. Our story could be about fury at a culture that we feel like doesn't align with us. Our story could be fear that, sometimes we do or don't get our political way. Our story could be urgency. Our story could be exhaustion. We could choose all kinds of things. Our story could be selfishness. We're just going to pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist. We're going to focus just on us. We could choose all kinds of stories. The story that Jesus chose as he prayed on the Mount of Olives, that not his will be done, but the Father's be done, was love. Love was his story. And I believe love should be our story.